Okay, so good morning, everyone, still. My name is Vlad Glaveanu. I'm coming from Denmark. And as a disclaimer, I have to say from the beginning that I am a psychologist. I didn't study marketing. I did work in consumer psychology for a couple of years. But the reason I'm here is actually thanks to a dialogue, an ongoing dialogue I've been having with Marie and Ben for the past 2 years, or I think a bit more. And the dialogue came about because I've been studying creativity from a psychological perspective, kind of cultural, sociological almost perspective, I would say, and I will explain why. And then we came together to put these ideas about consumer and creativity in the form of a paper and a model I'm going to discuss briefly now. So I'm a bit absolved of discussing in detail the implications for marketing of these ideas, but I will present to you the kind of scheme, the conceptual scheme that we have been discussing. So I think that much of the story of my experience with creativity actually starts from a monument like this. How many of you are familiar with this? Yes, people coming from Portugal, so I should be careful what I say. Okay. I should be careful because when I showed this image the first time, I was very happy when I found it in Lisbon, and to an audience, of course, made up of people from Portugal, and I said, "Oh, this is a wonderful, monument dedicated to Marco Polo," and the audience kind of froze because that's actually Vasco da Gama. Am I right? Yeah. So I'm not going to repeat that mistake again. So basically, this is a very interesting monument I found in walking in Lisbon, in Belém, which shows the image of the navigator. As you see, it's a big monument that is in the shape of a ship. And then you have on the sides all of these people, kind of people who do commerce and then religious figures and military figures coming up and building to this image of the navigator, which is in a way a leader, maybe a creator, if we want to extend the analogy. And this gave me the idea, or reading literature in psychology and other disciplines, sociology, anthropology, I saw that this kind of imagery is quite common, of course. It's the idea of the genius, it's the idea of the important person making a breakthrough, making a discovery, and then, of course, what we often tend to forget are all these other people leading to it. So I found very interesting as a visual metaphor the fact that you could have in a monument not only the one individual, although it's positioned a bit high up, but also a network kind of working behind that individual. In my doctoral studies, in my survey of the literature on creativity, I discovered, or I thought I discovered, three main paradigms in the study of creativity, as I said, at least coming from psychology. The first one I called the he paradigm because it relates to the image of the genius. And why the he? Because historically, and to uncover this ideological making of who is creating and then what kind of creativity was being legitimized by society, I thought it was fitting to call it the he paradigm. It's also he because it is a way of otherizing creativity. The creators, the real creators, are very few, and usually it's not us, it's not the person speaking, but it's someone else, a he, a third person. The image of the genius, I'm not going to get into details, of course, because I think, largely, of course, the literature, the scientific literature has overcome that, although it is very pervasive in our common sense lay representations of creativity. And I would challenge you to when you go out, to ask people about their first associations of creativity, and often you will find it is an important person, an important invention. Actually, we talked today about success stories, about brands, so that we have a great pool, and of course, this will never fade, will never go away, towards the idea of celebrated creativity, very visible creativity. The second, the transformation that happened largely in the last century, and maybe due to psychology a little bit, was a move towards what I call the I paradigm. The I paradigm that essentially says that each and every one of us has the potential, at least the potential, to be creative. And at least within psychology, we had a lot of studies of that potential. We had from kind of psychoanalytical, psychodynamic studies to more cognitive discussions or interpretations. And I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that, for instance, kind of a measure that was developed within this paradigm, I would say, of creativity relates it to divergent thinking, for instance. So there is a great relation between studying creativity, and again, the individual person, the cognitive processes of the individual, the personality, the motivation, but just like the he paradigm before, the I paradigm tends to focus on individual attributes. So my frustration with that, and as I said, I'm a social psychologist, or maybe I didn't mention that by training, was to try to move beyond that image. And of course, there are so many directions and ways of thinking, not only in psychology, but in other disciplines, that move you towards what I tend to call the we paradigm. It is the paradigm maybe of co-creation, of co-construction of creativity. And it is something that has concerned me for the last years when I tried to study it in relation to craft activities, but also creativity in science, in art, in different applied domains. Now, what I will kind of lead you to is a theoretical model, but before I get into that, and then Marie and Ben will illustrate it with research we've been conducting or discussing about, I would like to propose the idea that my thinking has kind of evolved from the we paradigm to theorizing what I call distributed creativity. Now, the word distributed, or the notion of distribution, is of course widely used, not only in psychology, in other disciplines, and it can have different meanings in different disciplines. My inspiration for talking about distributed creativity was taken from cognitive science, actually, where there is a lot of discussion nowadays, and not only nowadays, but for the past decades, about ways to extend the mind. If we do think that creativity has to do somehow with the mind, with the individual creator, then we need to question what is the border, if you want, what is the frontier of that mind, of that system. Because more and more we're being challenged to realize that the mind, if you want, is not only within our heads, but it extends into the world. If you think about it, for instance, when I try to remember to take the garbage out, sometimes I put something on the door at the front door just to remember, okay, I need to go and pick it up. So in a way, I am kind of extending my memory, my mnesic system, into the world by using an artifact. So this kind of thinking, of course, led to different books, and there is a wide literature, beginning with or being illustrated by books like Cognition in the Wild of Hutchings and many others. And the way I thought I could apply that to creativity in discussion with colleagues was to think about at least 3 lines of distribution for creative processes, which are, of course, interrelated. But just to be analytical and to discuss them a bit in turn, one would be sociality, the second materiality, and the third temporality. So creativity and sociality, this is something actually within the we paradigm. It involves the idea of an other, a human other, can be a person, can be a group. And this is what I think most attention has been dedicated to, how people create collaboratively, how they work in groups. And there is a great research now, research stream nowadays about people creating in groups. I'm sure, of course, we're all familiar with brainstorming, but also perhaps with the more scientific psychological literature that says, okay, but actually individuals working alone might be better at producing more ideas or more valuable ideas than people coming together in groups. So this is a bit puzzling, especially for practitioners who know, and we all know from experience, a lot of creative production takes place in groups. Well, without getting into that discussion, I'm going to just say that I think there is a lot of methodological biases and artifacts or productions of methodology around that, because what we tend to study often are artificial groups of people coming together, and we neglect real-life, long-term collaborations. The reasons why creativity is distributed at a social level differ, and they're very wide. On the one hand, we have moments of explicit collaboration, interaction between people, and these are very easy to spot if we go to the classroom, if we go to maybe even a brainstorming group, we see people communicating, exchanging ideas, and producing something, an idea and a product at the end. But then there are many implicit ways in which creativity is distributed socially. And if we think about social validation, there are many institutional systems of validation set in place, and I think we go back in a way to issues of power relations and whether consumers actually have the power to validate their own productions as creative, or the brand has that power. But in any case, creativity depends on social recognition or validation. There is nothing, I would say, maybe it's a bit provocative, as creativity in itself. If you think about it, the great creations of our time have not been or might not have been great creations if they were seen in another time, or might not be, you know, some time from now. So it's all very contextual. The second reason why creativity is socially distributed is because no one can produce anything completely alone. Even when you produce ideas in solitude, of course you rely on a network of collaboration, and this is something people like Howard Becker in the book The Art World described very nicely, and there are sociological ideas about division of labor that come into that. So we're all here writing our ideas, but the pen and pencil or the laptop we're using came from, of course, the activities of other people. So in a sense, the social world and the resources we use are all collectively constructed, and therefore the processes we put them, we engage in putting them to use, have that mark of the social. And finally, there is an even more radical way of thinking about sociality and creativity that takes the form of what people call dialogical theory or dialogical self. The fact that the creativity is distributed, if you want, outside of the person, but the mind, the human mind, is distributed kind of inside of the head, if you want. And here we draw on psychoanalytical ideas that talk about the role, the formative role of other people in our life. We have a lot of students in the room, so we can have the example of a student writing a paper. When writing a paper as a solitary, seemingly solitary activity, you need silence, you need to be isolated, but you're writing it with an addressee in mind. You're writing it for someone, and that someone is kind of a presence in the process of you writing the paper. So there is a dialogue, an internal dialogue between creator and other, even when people create in complete solitude. Moving on to creativity and materiality, there is a long discussion, and I was very happy to hear even today notions about the brand being, for 5 minutes, the brand being an agent. How come we can give agency, we can give almost humanity, intentionality to objects? And I think this is a long discussion. I'm just gonna go very briefly through it, but I'm happy to talk more about it. We have theories that show how objects can become partners in the process of creativity. One of them is the theory of affordances. All the objects we use, all the cultural products we engage with, have a certain intentionality inscribed into them. Chairs are for sitting, and the creators of chairs, well, mainly for sitting, the creators of chairs, in the way they build the artifact and in the cultural norms that invite us to use the artifact in a certain way, have placed that intentionality within the product. So if you think about affordances, what the concept says is actually invites us to think about what objects around us, brands included, afford one to do, make possible, allow a person to do with them. So in that sense, there are canonical affordances. They're very everyday, dominant ways in which we look at objects, but they're also non-canonical, maybe creative ways of looking at objects. If you think about the brick test, very famous, how many things can you do with a brick? We start usually by naming the most common ones, so we have a lot of canonical ways, and I'm going to build, I'm going to throw it. 3 minutes, okay. And then we move on to maybe non-canonical creative ways. Finally, moving into creativity and temporality, there are different time frames for thinking about creativity that are embedded within each other. One is a very broad socio-genetic, if you want, societal level of thinking about how ideas and social practices come about and transform at a historical time. Then we have an ontogenetic time, which is the lifespan of a person. So we look at the history of one individual, and stories about and everything we heard about narratives can fit into the way people actually create their own life stories and the creative process that entails. And finally, we have the microgenetic aspect, which is the creativity of the here and now, the moment-to-moment interaction and the construction of products in the present. And this is what many of us are actually interested in, but it's also hard to capture because we need to be there, for instance, when that process takes place. So often we rely on narratives or retrospective accounts of the process. So finally, to end, and I think Ben and Marie will pick up on that in the presentation, we thought about ways of overcoming a more individualistic type of thinking about creativity that places so much emphasis on the individual person. And this is kind of embedded within the classic framework in the field of person, product, process, and press, for those of you who are familiar with this. So the dynamic system we came about proposing and applying was a kind of a 5A framework that articulates actors, audiences, actions, artifacts, and affordances. So it reconceptualizes the creative person not as an isolated individual, but as a social agent or actor within a field of relationships where he or she might have more or less power in relation to a certain audience. At the same time, it's interesting to see the dynamic between actors and audiences, because what we think is an actor at some point becomes an audience at another. And if you think about consumers and brands and industry, you might see how they exchange this position between actor and audience at different types of the moments of the process. So the effort is actually to articulate this 5A framework into something more practical, and I think the next presentation will talk about a very mundane example and trying to put this together in that way. So I think I'm running out of time. Thank you for this. Thank you.